this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the place of additional findings in personalised prevention and looking at some of our participants' perspectives. And so I'm going to be focusing on some of our Wellcome-funded research on ethical preparedness in genomic medicine. So through a range of conceptual and empirical projects, which are detailed on the slide, we've been examining the ethical and social challenges that genomic medicine presents for those living and working with genetic and genomic results. So as part of that programme of work, we've been conducting a qualitative longitudinal study exploring patients' and families' experiences of genomic medicine. And over the past 5 years, we've used repeat interviews and a range of creative methods, as demonstrated on the slide, to document the experiences of 25 cases. So that includes patients, partners, parents of patients, and adult children. And 20 of our participants accessed genomic testing through their involvement in the 100,000 Genomes Project, which is a UK-based initiative designed to offer whole genome sequencing to patients with a rare disease or cancer. So not sure how familiar you are with the 100,000 Genomes Project, but just to give you kind of a brief overview. So the main aim of the 100,000 Genomes Project was to provide a diagnosis of the rare disease or the cancer mechanism, but as part of that study, participants were offered the opportunity to opt in or opt out of receiving additional findings. So additional findings are sometimes known as incidental or secondary findings, which I won't go into further here, but just to say that these are findings from the genetic code that might indicate a predisposition to another condition that's unrelated to the original reason for testing. So the list of additional findings were designed to only identify a clear increased risk of developing an actionable health condition. So you can see some examples on the slide here, those that were relevant to adults and those that were relevant to children. So as part of our project, we asked participants what their rationale was for opting in or opting out of receiving additional findings, their recollections of the explanation, and what they imagined additional findings might mean for them and their family. So all those our participants at the wider 100,000 Genomes Project study experienced a really long wait to receive additional findings, with the first batch of letters distributed approximately 4 years after participants originally enrolled into the project. So it's not really much of a surprise then that many couldn't recall the precise nature of what they'd agreed to, or actually whether they'd even opted in to receive additional findings. So it wasn't just the passage of time that shaped their recollections, but for many, additional findings just featured as a relatively low priority compared to their main reason for their involvement in the project. So letters were then sent out to all, regardless of the outcomes. And some of our participants spoke about receiving this random letter out of the blue. They'd kind of forgotten that the possibility that it might come, so had kind of hadn't expected to receive a letter when they did. And some had kind of falsely reassured themselves that no news is good news. So if I haven't had a letter, that must mean that nothing has been found. So I just wanted to focus on sort of 3 themes that we've identified from our participants' accounts. And the first of those is ambivalence. And even though few could recall details of exactly what they'd agreed to, for some, their emotional responses to the decision-making process were really vivid. Accounts from parents who'd participated in whole genome sequencing to aid the diagnosis of a child were filled with ambivalence and anxiety about what additional findings might mean for others. So one of our participants, Monica, who'd been on this decade-long quest to understand her son's conditions, spoke of the enormity of the decision, eventually choosing to opt in, but not for the potential insights it might offer into her own health risks, but in the hope that it might help her son's diagnosis. So she said, do you tick that box, do you not tick that box? If they tell me that I'm predisposed to something, do I want to know or do I not want to know? But then I decided, well, actually, if they say I'm predisposed to something, maybe that bit of information will be useful for looking into my son's health. I remember being nervous about it, but then I just thought I was so desperate to get a diagnosis for my son that I thought that, any information would be useful. Similar anxieties were discussed by others, including one of our participants, Lydia, who was concerned about the potential implications for her siblings who weren't part of the 100,000 Genomes Project. And Lydia said, but even now I can read back my journal, which describes I was sort of worrying about things, like if I got additional findings, and it turns out I had a variant, like a predisposition to cancer or something like that. And then I was worrying about what that would mean for my sisters and whether they would get testing or any kind of monitoring as a result of that result. So I opted out of additional findings on the basis of a lot of these sorts of anxieties. So whilst the majority opted in, others decided that they simply did not want to know about heritable risks, often because they were already grappling with other health conditions or the health of others. So the second theme that we've identified relates to inevitability. And during the interviews, it was common for participants to share their own observations of disease histories within their families and to surmise about potential hereditary risks to which they felt they might be susceptible. For some, accounts about decision-making in relation to additional findings were couched in terms of whether an additional finding might corroborate or challenge their existing perceptions of familial risks. So Clive said, when I asked him whether he decided to opt in or opt out, for me personally, it was because both my parents died of cancer. So with my dad, it was liver cancer, and with my mum, it's leukemia. So it'd be really useful and interesting to know whether I've got any susceptibility of that from them, and not just accept the fact that I'm their child and therefore I'm likely to have it. But it's the knowledge and information that's always useful, and that's why I signed up for it. And Clive, actually, without being asked, spent a lot of time drawing out kind of a family tree with his kind of what he thought were connections between generations and looking to the future as well. And then some of our participants, like Shirley, were convinced about the heritability of several conditions, and she traced what she thought was a clear family history of cancer running through past and present generations. And she was really keen to ensure that all relatives were vigilant regarding their potential symptoms. These included those in their teens for whom any risks may not be relevant until later life. She really strongly felt that they need to know that there is a possibility there's something going on in the family, and they've got to be aware of what these things are. So there was a sense of inevitability in some of the accounts. So from those like Shirley's, who felt that she could see really clear patterns of heritable risk, to those who believed that if they were going to develop a health condition, they were going to do so anyway, and that knowing about the possibility just wouldn't change anything, except that it might have kind of implications for their mental health. And then the third theme relates to relationality, and we've sort of touched upon this already. But so whilst participants like Monica and Lydia, who I mentioned earlier, expressed a great deal of anxiety about the potential implications of additional findings, others saw value in them as a collective resource for family members and for future generations. So Amanda said, well, again, if it's something we can do something about, it's useful to know. Plus, again, if it goes back to my kids, so if they did find anything, and I'm absolutely sure they won't find anything, but again, if you just have that gut feeling that if they did, then again, it's information that might be useful for my children and for their children. So there's a real sense of looking towards future generations and potential grandchildren when making this decision. And Claire said, I think for me it was always learning about understanding the conditions, how they're caused, and what I could do about it for future generations going forward. And some saw kind of whether their decisions whether to opt in or opt out of additional findings was about this wider research endeavour, so not just looking about future generations, but a bigger societal impact, and that opting out might be detrimental to the study. So Charles kind of felt he really had to opt into additional findings, so he didn't want to inhibit the project. So rather than emphasising whether additional findings might provide insights into their own increased risks of developing a health condition, many seem to prioritise the potential benefits to others. So in conclusion, personalised prevention tends to be viewed in an individualised manner with a focus on tailoring preventative measures to an individual. 100,000 Genomes Project participants were offered additional findings on the basis that any outcome might enable them to access health interventions such as early screening. But an individualised approach is not really apt for genomic medicine, as family members may be directly affected by the outcome of the test in others. So this is a really brief snapshot of our work, but I hope it's shown some of the more relational lens through which many participants viewed additional findings and how this shaped their decision making. So many of the accounts were imbued with a strong sense of genetic responsibility to others, and the focus on the contribution of additional findings to knowledge accumulation was also apparent. I also think it's really important to reiterate that some seem to think that the scope of additional findings was much wider than the list I presented earlier. So this delay in returning the outcomes, coupled with the nature of participants' own journeys through genomics, many of which were very long and full of uncertainty, meant that additional findings were rarely at the forefront of people's minds. Thank you.